Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, The COVID-19 Effect on Holiday 2020, with unique perspective from Nielsen and Microsoft. I'm Chrissy Wissinger, your moderator. Joining me today is Nicole Collida Davis, Nielsen SVP, North American Consumer Intelligence, Chris Dieringer, Senior Director of Industry Solutions at Microsoft of Retail and CPG, and Thomas Kilbane, Senior Economist here at Prevedere. We've packed this discussion with great information about the consumer and holiday 2020, so we want to get right to it. We'll start with Nicole providing her analysis on the ever-evolving American consumer. Thank you, Nicole, for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Chrissy. We are really excited to be back in what I believe is the fourth in a series that we've been doing on consumer behavior and the economic outlook. As we wrapped up our last session, we talked quite a bit about the potential economic impact as consumers began to shift need states. We've previously seen consumers, at the onset of COVID-19, acting with health at the forefront of their minds. And we've seen the rise of a new need state with consumers, and that's really revolving around economic impact. Specifically, we detailed two new consumer groups that have arisen and have been most impacted to date financially. These financially constrained consumers are at a tipping point, and they're even more critical to understand. So we're going to spend our time together today really digging into these newly constrained consumers and understanding what the next several weeks and months into the upcoming holiday period will look like for these consumers. I just want to set the stage by reminding everyone that it took 10 years for us to regain the jobs that were lost during the Great Recession. To date, in 2020, 24% of American households have seen some level of financial impact as a result of COVID-19. And many of these households are making up our financially constrained consumer segment. The reality is these consumers will have an impact on our economy potentially for years to come. As we think about the pending holiday season, understanding these spending pattern shifts will really be critical to any successful strategy. These consumers are quite sizable, and I want to spend a couple minutes really double-clicking into who they are. This financially strained consumer segment is worth almost $200 billion in CPG buying power. It's a huge amount of money that will really impact any strategy for the rest of the year and into 2021. Probably most interesting is that these financially constrained consumers do not necessarily mean low income or lower income households. These consumers span all income levels, all ethnicities, and all age groups. In fact, the common denominator for these consumers is just the fact that they've experienced some level of financial loss as a result of COVID-19. As I mentioned, this group is sizable. So let's dig into some of the things that have impacted their buying power over the last several months. The biggest impact that these consumers really realized was as a result of stimulus packages that flooded the market in the April, May, June time period. This really has defined a significant shift in behavior for this consumer group, and I think that's pretty critical to understand. Stimulus dollars became absolutely necessary for these households when it came to certain key activities like buying food and keeping household items in stock and paying utility bills and really, quite frankly, keeping the lights on in some instances for their households. This was a really important piece of what was happening during the rise of COVID for many of these consumers. And as you can imagine, it also had an incredible impact on a consumer's psyche. These consumers are stressed to the max, and they relied heavily on that help from stimulus. So when you think about targeting these consumers, understanding how to engage with them, you really have to have that in the back of your mind. Share of mind for these consumers is strapped at best. They've got a lot going on and a lot on their mind in terms of just keeping their households running smoothly. So as you head into the holidays, a successful strategy will really revolve around relating to these consumers in a different way. Understanding not only what they need, but where they're fulfilling those needs and how you can best interact with them where they are will be critical to your success. The importance of stimulus for these consumers is really brought to life when you look at their share of CPG spend. So we're simply here looking at this segment of consumers in isolation, our newly strained consumers, and understanding how their share shifted as COVID rose early in the March time period, and as it continued to impact behavior heading into August and even early September. And what you can see is that for these newly constrained consumers, share peaked from April through mid-July. Some of this is due to household size. We know that consumers were home more, and those with larger households were continuing to stockpile in terms of their purchases. But you can see a dramatic jump in volume when stimulus packages were released in that mid-April to early May time period. We saw the newly constrained consumers' share of total CPG spend jump to a high. And while it's still really early to tell exactly what will happen, as we look through the month of August and into early September, we start to see a decline in that share of CPG volume. It is early, but we do expect that this will be a continued trend over the coming months as stimulus dollars really exit these consumers' households, and these consumers are having to spend that share of mind again on things like keeping the utility bills paid and keeping food on the table for their households. As these consumer need states really begin to shift due to economic concerns, we see a lot of fluidity in terms of where these consumers shop. It's not so important here to take away the absolute changes in trend across different channels, but more so to understand that these financially constrained consumers are spending their dollars in a true omni-channel environment. This isn't a trend that's necessarily different than what you might expect to see, but it is different than what we saw early in COVID, when we saw consumers' willingness to pay, premium prices or to adjust their selection needs based on what was available, based on limited shopping opportunities or streamlining shopping into one channel, really start to occur. For these households, we're seeing that fluidity or that diversification in where they shop in order to meet household needs in new and different ways. At the end of the day, the mass channel has been a very important channel for this consumer set, and we'll see that continue to rise as we move through the fall and into the holidays. One of the most interesting data points, though, is the potential for e-commerce to dwindle over the months to come. I think that will be very telling as we start to track things like Prime Day right around the corner and the online holiday shopping extravaganza that happens in many households as they prepare, particularly for the later in the year holidays. What these consumers buy has also shifted a bit. So this is just an example of two different departments in the store as it relates to CPG and the inverse trends that we've seen as a result of stimulus dollars being in the market for these newly constrained consumers. On the left-hand side, we're examining the frozen department, and what you'll see is that early in COVID, the frozen department soared for these consumers. The newly constrained consumer was spending a maximum amount of their dollars in the frozen department, and their share of that department really soared. As stimulus came into the market, we saw that pull back just a bit. And in the most recent time periods, we're seeing that begin to rise again. In the fresh produce department, we're seeing the exact opposite. As stimulus dollars really came into the market, consumers were spending more in the fresh produce area and really, really engaging with that department in new and different ways. Now, it might be easy to look at this chart and say simply that these are pretty small changes when you look over an extended period of time. But I would remind you that with this consumer segment accounting for almost $200 billion in buying power, we're talking about tens of millions of dollars with every single tenth of a point of change that we see. So keep that in mind as you think about what this might look like in the weeks and months to come for your consumers. One thing that's quite interesting that we haven't yet seen is the shift to private label. This was really a hallmark of the Great Recession. And early in COVID, We fielded so many questions around what we expected the private label trajectory to be, as we expected financial impact as a result of this pandemic. And the reality is we haven't seen it. So what I bring everybody back to is this idea that the financially constrained consumer is different this time around. These are households of every income, every background, every ethnicity and age, and they're all being impacted in different ways. One thing that we're seeing is a shift in premiumization. So some consumers are staying in a premium segment, but trading maybe from a very high-end premium item to a lower-end premium item, while some are trading between different brands, are really becoming very, very deal sensitive. And I think of all of the things that we've talked about, this will be one of the most interesting things that we'll see play out, particularly in the CPG space as we plan for the holidays. I think about something as simple as turkey. There are many consumers that will fall into this new constrained consumer set that may have been buying fresh, organic turkeys or pre-made meals that were easy on them, but maybe not as easy on their wallets. And this year, I expect that we may see a shift in something even as simple as that. So it'll be very, very telling to watch how this rolls out over time. And I think effective strategies as you plan for the holiday will really, as I mentioned before, meet those consumers where they are in terms of channel diversification, but also address these consumers' concerns through deal strategy that makes sense for the consumers that you are targeting. That doesn't mean dropping price in every instance. It means understanding your brand or your retail role to this consumer and activating on it accordingly. I actually think that attracting new buyers for brands and for retailers will be a really big opportunity heading into the holidays as a result of understanding who these consumers are and what they're looking for from you in their engagement. At the end of the day, the most successful thing that you can do is root yourself in the shopper and truly understand their path to purchase. It's important to understand these shifts within these newly constrained consumers and these consumers' role in your brand strategy or retail strategy playbook. It's clear that the world is way too unpredictable to have an ironclad playbook for any scenario. So using a segmentation that's as fluid as your consumer will be critical. After all of that is said and done, create your strategy, set your plan, and execute with confidence, and you will be able to tackle this new consumer and their evolving trends over the upcoming holiday period. And so with that, I'm excited to pass it over to Chris, who's going to talk more about what we can expect in terms of Microsoft's perspective on holiday marketplace trends and what we'll see going forward. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Nicole. Yeah, great insights that you provided there. And, I think, the bottom line is very clear that people are definitely thinking, feeling, and making decisions differently. And while no one's really had a chance to intersect the crystal ball of COVID and holiday, we're doing our best to try to look at these trends, indicators that are coming through and where companies and our customers are oriented around that. But what's definitely clear, and I'll get more into this, is companies definitely need to consider where they look at their digital investments and putting digital in the center and core of just about everything that they do. And I'll bleed into that with the three areas that I'll mention here around some of the holiday insights we're seeing. So the first one you can see here is plan early, right? Consumers are starting sooner. They have the opportunity to spend more and will vote on convenience. This, as Nicole talked about, this could be adjusted in a second wave of stimulus checks. I'm not sure how that's going to work, when that will come through, or what will happen, and if that will be right around peak or holiday season. But one of the points of this is to look at the promotions and the offers that you have, and to get those in consumers' hands now. 54% of shoppers that we find are shopping early this year versus last year. That's at around 42%, and 32% of those are starting as early as October. So as you're reading this right now, companies are preparing, planning, and providing offers out for those valuable dollars that Nicole talked about earlier. The other piece around this, that last stat, centers around convenience. 56% of consumers show that are choosing one retailer over another based on these delivery options. And again, one of the ways to think about this is making the returns process easier. Given changes in consumers and that rise of e-commerce, particularly with COVID and the inability of sometimes try certain products on, touch, feel, or move with those physically, don't focus too much on the restock fees or consumers having to work through a help desk to complete a return. Think about ways of drawing consumers back into stores, given even more frictionless experiences with that possibility to upsell. An example of that, I'm not sure if anyone has seen in the QSR sector, Domino's right now is one of the top leading companies coming out of COVID. And right now, you can order a pizza simply through texting a pizza emoji to them. I mean, that's some of the frictionless ways that you could possibly interact with the business during COVID-19. Another one, Starbucks arguably changed the way that mobile order and pay has been adopted in the market, blending both digital and physical areas together. They can recognize you when you go into a store. They can reach out to you with a specific offer. Sometimes the online lines in store are longer than the actual physical lines. To put a couple things in perspective there, 25.4 million users go through Starbucks mobile pay today. Apple Pay, which is in a market, sits around 27 million, and a distant third is Google Pay at 12. So when we think about like what they've been able to do, provide a valuable value exchange to consumers who are willing to invest in their phone real estate on their app, it's there, it's strong, and those mobile online offers that I'm going to go into in a little bit help commerce across not just physical, but your digital channels, which gets to the next. Prepping in both of those areas. And people do think about e-com and the rise of e-commerce, but it has such a fast and far-reaching effect back to order management, in-store, ERP. It touches many areas. Just to double down on that again, I like to talk in examples. If you saw, in consumer electronics, Best Buy reported Q2 online sales thought up 242% compared to the previous year, with higher traffic from browsing versus buying. And that really, when we look at the rise of e-commerce that comes through that, as I mentioned, it's interconnected and touches many different things. Also, something to be aware of are the issues that come in stores with the rise of sales, as well as out of stores, like theft or shrinkage or fraud. And that can happen with online theft or shrinkage or fraud. In our stores specifically, and I'm talking about our Microsoft Direct channel, we saw about a 76, we had operational expenses, we saved around 76 million, and saw a 9% revenue lift on about a $10 billion business. And that was through implementing fraud protection solutions. We also had another large software gaming company in about 3.5 months improve their revenue by about 12 million. So not only are you looking to provide new capabilities, but harden, right, and provide offers to people directly that keep your brand safe as well as theirs. Which gets down to the next, rise of mobile apps. You can see 200% increase of mobile downloads started when social distancing started, and that actually increased another 12 to 15% once the first stimulus checks come through. And I talked about that value exchange and why it is important. Customers will spend about 2 to 3 times with the brand that they install onto their mobile app as opposed to those that don't. McDonald's specifically, in the QSR section as well, saw a 7 times conversion rate for any offers that they have through their mobile, with a 47% increase in tray size for relevant offers. And that's real dollars, real amount, real money for you to pull in consumers and customers through that value and ecosystem. It also, if you think about, you want to help look at and focus on in-store efficiency. One of the things we talk about around, COVID is the foot traffic that's being reduced in stores. We used to have this thought that, bring more people in stores, give them great experiences, keep them engaged with them longer to upsell, provide, that strong customer to brand relationship and, see greater returns on both units as well as revenue. Now that's definitely something that's being readjusted, right? With one-way lanes in grocery stores, or the amount of space you have inside or even outside of a store. Concierge, we talk about, I'll get into this to a second, like concierge bots, other services and solutions and capabilities that you can apply around this technical ecosystem, important, but also just even appointments. are great ways to solve some of this, right? Your ability to create or look at the availability of store associates or times in store, as well as creating appointment anchors, and allows you as a customer that time in store and gives you that solid value exchange with the brand as well. Neiman Marcus, great example, recently deployed one of our booking solutions and in record time got up the bookings tool on tools they already owned, all through online and mobile apps that they have today. The last bullet here, so the note on BOPIS, BORIS, and BOPAC, if you're not familiar with the terms, buy online, pick up in store, buy online, return in store, or buy online, pick up at curb. The explosions, I think even broader than that 30% number. Target reported in Q2 digital comp sales were up nearly 200%, with same store and comp sales up around 11. Same day services, however, saw more than 270% growth, and specifically things like their drive up and go was as high as 734%. And that's really, it's easy to understand why, right? And why customers would be clamoring for this. When you combine the benefits of online shopping, which is easy to search and find what you're looking for, with the best of the brick and mortar shopping and products that you can pick up immediately at that time, it adds that value and provides that value for customers and consumers. Also, for you as a company, reducing that additional shipping cost is incredibly important and a thing to look at, specifically in an area where frictionless companies have really driven the free shipping, free returns component. So any opportunity you have to drive people by your store, you can cut that cost out, as well as the potential to upsell directly with your brand ambassadors, store associates, any one of those directly there for you to operate with today. Replicating in-store experiences elsewhere. So another thing to think about with this is, as I mentioned, people could be out in parking lots, depending on if you're in warmer or colder weather climates. It's interesting to think about how you might shelter or provide comfort from that perspective. Mobile point of sales, people in niche conversations, upsell opportunities. All these are critical components to make sure that your customers are aware of, as well as critically to communicate some of those wait times in various locations. There's a rise of virtual queues for social distancing. These are great ways to allow brands to provide consumers and customers that confidence that I can show up when I want to, and the associate and or service will be there for me when I need. Great out-of-box solutions that allow you to start small, think fast, and really test and deploy these in market. Also, I think looking for new ways to fulfill orders, very important. Checkout lines have always kind of caused friction, but a rise of these DoorDash companies like the Grub Hubs or DoorDash, they've exploded in revenue. But the trick here, right, is that's a cost to your business. In some cases, and with some customers, these are loss leaders with potentially your fastest growing channel you're taking a hit at. So how can you mobilize on that? Bringing some of that into your own mobile app, into your own ecosystem, not necessarily all the way to a full grab and go, but a scan and go with an app is a great way to think about this. The stats I see is 70% of people who use it once will use it more often. So that first try is incredibly important. Once people use those, on average, they spend about 6% more than they did previously. And checkout times can drop from 3 to 4 minutes down to 15 seconds. Finally, on human labor costs, those typically sit around 48% on average per transaction, where you can see that drop all the way to 4 to 5%. When we think about, again, I keep talking about this, the value exchange of your mobile app, bringing people into your ecosystem, giving you that value exchange, they'll vote with their dollars and continue to vote with their dollars while they have you prevalent and top of mind in one of their devices, in one of their own devices, meaning phones that they own. Which brings me over to the third, personalization. Never underestimate the power of personalization. And a quick definition on that, as I think of it, is proximity, identity, and content, right? Proximity meaning taking the both digital and physical footprints that you have in a store versus your digital footprints that you have across preferences, search options, other ways that you engage with the brand digitally, making sure they identify you as a specific person so they know who your customer is, where you're spending time, and then all of that served up to relevant content based on a platform of achievable data. one of the ways in that, I think social media is finally having quantifiable advances in the social commerce space. 28% of consumers are buying products in social media today, which is more than usual. And purchases from the social channels, and I'm referring to the biggest increases of Q2 in 2020, have been growing 104% across the entire ecosystem. Now, also why that's important, 80% of consumers want their brand social channels to facilitate a sense of community and offer support through those, these kind of trying times and needs. So you as a brand and as a company have the opportunity to, create these communities, drive compassion, offer empathetic messages, through these social channels that consumers and customers are clamoring for. The next stat that we have in here again is the rise of AI, and consumer retail spending is expected to reach about 142 billion by 2024, and that's an increase you can see of 2.8 billion from 2019. So if you think about this, virtual assistants can save time on support costs, and we've seen as high as 25% around support costs in that tier 1 being completely automated. They give more capabilities around 24/7 support. They increase customer NSAT. We've seen 2 to 4 points increase on implementations of these, and they build brand affinity and connection directly with your consumer and engage in ways that you as a staff necessarily haven't been able to in the past. And typically, if you can answer this one question, where is my order, that invariably pays for the investment in itself in that initial project today. So definitely on the rise and a way to think and act with brands. And then the last there, 70% of consumers will share personal data where they get strong value exchange. And by that means greater benefit of online insecurity and convenience. And, I have another example here in this. We, in partnership with the QSR, have centered around data to offer that, app value exchange that I talked about. And this is a company that considers themselves a technology company that happens to sell burritos, and that's Chipotle. Originally, Chipotle had about 80 million unique credit card numbers tied to inline restaurant transactions, but they couldn't tie those back to customer identities. They also couldn't effectively drive customers to Chipotle rewards loyalty programs that they launched back in March of around 2019. And that limited the ability for them to build brand awareness and drive loyalty. So what we did with them, we created a CDP, it's a customer data platform to develop deeper relationships and drive loyalty for customers. That's that foundation of data. With that customer profile, then you can offer and apply all sorts of third-party syndicate data across marketing channels, meaning hotel occupancy rates, weather, sporting events, all sorts of different components. And then clean up the entire information management practice from that data lake to reference data to analytics to drive that loyalty and engagement. If we think about the results, they had 14 million in rewards loyalty members since launch that we've driven, and around 0.21 billion which is an increase of 216% in digital sales for their Q2. We saw that's about a 70% increase in digital sales since we launched this program. And we increased, and that's an increase of 65% newly enrolled rewards members that have an additional $45 of net spend per customer. On top of that, their app moved up to the top 10 on both the Apple and Android stores. So if we look at tying and knitting many of these things together, as mentioned before, there's no crystal ball or magic recipe that's going to ironclad make this, let's say, COVID and holiday section perfect. But there are some trends and areas to look at that where you're putting digital at the center of your strategy to capitalize on some of those. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and transition over to Thomas, and he's going to talk about the health of the consumer leading into this holiday season. Thomas, over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Nicole, as well, both bringing great insights. So with all of that talk about what consumers are up to, the trends, their preferences, how things are changing as we head into the holiday season, I really want to just briefly talk about the overall health and financial health of the consumer, which I think has been harder to capture during this period of 2020 than in most periods. I think one of the best things that we can do is actually split the health of the consumer into competing effects that we've experienced during 2020, because it's going to help us to think about how to expect the consumer to perform moving forward. The first thing is that, of course, we're in a recession, and that has lowered consumer health and lowered consumer spending. That is probably a given, but it doesn't really feel like that to many, especially depending on where you are in the market. And that's really, I think, because of these final two effects, which are somewhat unique to this particular recession. And in the middle here, we're talking about government stimulus, which was mentioned by both Nicole and Chris, that you really can't talk about the consumer experience in 2020 without talking about the stimulus. We'll dig into that a little bit more here in just a second and what we can expect from that moving forward. But there's no question that this has greatly changed the picture for the consumer in 2020 and what we've experienced up to this point. And so now we have competing effects, right? We have a recession, which is going to naturally lower consumer health and consumer spending, but we have this stimulus, which has been really, really large, particularly in the US relative to what we've seen in past recessions, that is raising it. And then the last thing is that, we've actually seen with the health crisis, this incredible shift, in consumer spending. This is well beyond what we normally would see in a recession. We're not just talking about shifting as in, trading down tiers or to a private label. We're talking about, changing our lives and all of the spending that necessitates, a lot of switching costs in the economic jargon. Some of those we do think will continue on for some time. You're talking about, going to the movie theater less, but spending more on video streaming instead, that sort of thing. But I also think that there's a lot of one-time costs there. So we'll talk a little bit about that, where, some things that probably have pumped up consumer spending up to this point in 2020 that are probably not going to continue as well. So you have all three of these competing effects, and depending on where you are in the market and what you're selling, you may not realize that. You may not think about it. You just see your own bottom line. But understanding these competing effects and separating them out is really going to be important moving forward, because the key thing is that we do not think that all of these effects are going to unravel at the same speed and the same time. So understanding which of these is the strongest impact on you and what to expect from it moving forward is going to be really critical. So just to drive home the point on the fact that recession has lowered consumer spending and that we expect this to be a factor moving forward, maybe even more evident than what it's been up to this point, is because you'd have to take a look at the labor market. This is your U.S. consumer here, right? It's going to be difficult to maintain a healthy U.S. consumer if the consumer isn't working themselves. And what we're looking at here is basically we're going to cut through all of the economics and economic jargon that goes into building an unemployment rate, which spiked very high at the beginning of this crisis and has recovered since then, fairly strongly, probably more strongly than many thought. But there's a lot of issues with using the unemployment rate and tracking the labor market and the health of the U.S. consumer. So what we're going to do here is just cut through all that and say, what percent of our population in prime working age are actually at work? We're tracking 25 to 54-year-old population right here, and we can see that where we are today is about 75% of this population is working. That is way above where it was back in April, but it's also way, way, way down from where we would expect it to be in a healthy economy. You can see as a comparison point back in the last recession at the very bottom, that's about right where we are today. And that was actually at the beginning of the recovery. As the recession was over, the last recession in 2009, middle of 2009, it took a very long time for the labor market to recover. And so as we think about how long it takes, generally speaking, looking back at these recessions, we know that it's going to be a long road to full recovery here as well, regardless of what the unique circumstances that got us into this recession in the first place. So we do think that there is going to be some pressure, upward pressure, thankfully, to help this recover a little bit faster this time around. One of the things that is driving, keeping or holding this down or driving this down is the need to provide, family care, homeschooling if your kids aren't in school, if you're concerned about your health, getting back into the workplace. If those things are alleviated, from the health crisis, then this has the potential to push this up faster than we would have seen in the past. But unfortunately, we also think that there's going to continue to be downward pressure on this because, unlike where we were back in December of 2009, where we're totally past the recession, most of cuts have happened. We still see cuts happening, depending on the industry, but there's a lot of different industries and areas of the economy that have not fully cut. It wasn't just the U.S. consumer that received stimulus, right? Businesses received stimulus. Often that was tied to maintaining employment. And we see that as a lot of that expires, there are more cuts being made. And so we're going to see competing impacts on this as well. But the bottom line is that this is one of these things that we expect, even if the health crisis goes away fairly quickly as we head into 2021, we do not expect that this is going to be able to recover. This is going to take time. It's been quite some, over a decade since we had the last recession in the U.S. And so we're here now, and we're going to have to deal with this. So no question, even if it's been hard to feel in certain areas that the consumer has been weak in 2020, we certainly see this being a factor heading into the holiday season. But then, of course, we need to talk about the stimulus, right? Because this is the competing effect. And we say, well, what recession? When you look at the personal income that the consumers have received in the U.S. up to this point. It's already been mentioned, right? So we'll focus mostly about what's going to happen moving forward. But you can see this, right as everything is being shut down, all of a sudden the U.S. consumer gets a raise in April, right? And with cash payments going out. And really what's maintained it since then is the enhanced unemployment benefits. We have data that shows that those who have received unemployment, these enhanced unemployment benefits, have actually raised their spending relative to when they were employed. So they lost their employment, but actually raised their spending. But now we're reaching the end of summer and we're heading into fall, and there was a very mild extension of some of these enhanced unemployment benefits after the big deadline at the end of July. But even that mild extension is expiring now. The picture that we are painting then is for what you can expect moving forward at this point includes no new rounds of federal stimulus, which of course that can change, and we'll talk about, that could change the picture for 2021 in particular, based on who's in control of government and what happens with the economy between now and then. But as of right now, we need to plan for the rest of the year, certainly, for this sort of a picture where that stimulus is really, as Nicole mentioned, it's almost gone, right? And so we can see now that we're going to have to deal with these effects that the consumers typically feel during a recession that we haven't had to deal with very much up to this point. So as this rolls off, then the recession may be felt a bit more. But again, it really depends where you are. Where are you in the market, and what are you selling? Because there are plenty of areas that have really thrived during this crazy time. This chart here highlights what has happened up to this point, but I think it can also help us sort of illustrate and think about what we can expect as we move into the holiday season and into 2021. As I said, I think some of these are switching costs, lifestyle changes. All of a sudden, we're spending so much more time at home, and we realize that we need to fix up that backyard, or it's a great time to do that project that you have always been putting off. And we've definitely seen evidence in the data that people are doing that. The home and garden stuff has gone through the roof. Games, toys, hobbies, things you're doing at home, right? The switch from the movies and live entertainment to video streaming. Some of that stuff we expect to continue, right? Where we have been with restaurants and bars and travel and all this stuff, it's been so far down, it's crazy, right? Since the crisis hit, we do expect this to continue to recover, but it's also safe to say that it's not going to be anywhere close to fully recovering during this holiday season when so many people are typically traveling. And so I think that even if we expect the consumer to be weaker heading into this holiday season, and then probably into 2021 as well, thinking about the holiday season, those who have maintained their employment and, even if they're spending 5 to 10% less on average this year than they did in the past, because they're going to be saving on some of those travel plans, or saving on the hotels or the live entertainment that they would typically do around the end of the year, that's going to leave some money for there to be still plenty of winners, right, and still plenty of opportunities in the market. And so I think you look at, as people move indoors, right, all those outdoor projects maybe have exhausted themselves at this point, but there's new indoor ones to apply themselves to, right? And so household goods, that home entertainment center that you've been waiting for the right time to splurge on, those kinds of things might do very well as we head into the holiday season. And I think there's probably still plenty of money left over for games, toys, electronics, that sort of thing, for those who are doing okay through this time and probably going to be saving a little money, as we said, from some of these other areas. But overall, I do think that it's important to realize that we have to expect the consumer to be weak. We have to expect the consumer to be weaker than they have been in the past few years as we head into this holiday season. And then as we think about even beyond that into 2021, to think about how your product or service has been impacted by this crazy time in 2020, and to think about the three different categories of impacts that we laid out here. The recession certainly is a drag on almost all, unless you're a value product, it's going to be a drag, right? But the stimulus has really impacted us and pumped up the health of the consumer, and that's really been a huge deal for many categories. And then how about the shifting? Think about the shifting. Have you benefited or have you lost from this? Those things may not unravel at the same period. At this point, we expect probably that the consumers will begin to adapt to a new normal for throughout 2021 as the health crisis hopefully dissipates. But we actually expect the economic recovery to be the one that probably lasts or takes the longest.
And that concludes today's webinar. A special thank you to Nicole, Chris, and Thomas for your expertise today. This conversation is vital heading into the holiday season. And thank you to everyone listening in on the discussion. Should you have any questions for any of our guests, please contact me using the contact info on the screen. Have a nice day.